A mystery that cannot be explained. An enigma that defies reason. A surprising and unexpected answer. To encounter such a mystery firsthand may change your life forever. Face to face with the greatest riddles of the ages, the world's most profound mysteries reach out and touch your life in ways you never imagined possible. Extreme Mysteries.
In 1967, the tiny nation of Israel achieved one of the most stunning military victories of all time. During a war that lasted just 6 days, Israel fought on 3 fronts and overcame enemy forces that outnumbered its troops by a 2-to-1 margin. Leaders of the Jewish state claimed the victory was a result of superior military planning. But is there more to the story? Was there something going on behind the scenes of the 6-day war? Something that tipped the scales in Israel's favor? Could it be, as the Arabs claimed, that their defeat was accomplished only with the intervention by the Americans? How was such a miraculous victory possible? Did the Soviet Union and the United States come to the brink of nuclear war? And is the present turmoil in the Middle East setting the stage for history to repeat itself? Are there ancient writings that supposedly predicted Israel's victory in the war? If they do exist, what other secrets might they reveal about Israel's future and the future of the human race? How did Israel win the 6-day war? Was it a military marvel or a miracle? Jerusalem. The 6,000-year-old city on a hill that is the spiritual home to 3 major world religions. Christians, Muslims, and Jews attempt to coexist here. And in spite of this, or perhaps because of it, Jerusalem has almost never known peace. And so, it may seem strange to wonder about the significance of one confrontation that happened more than 30 years ago. But the 6-day war was much more than just another conflict in a long string of battles. There was a lot more at stake in the 6-day war than just the security of Israel, though. New evidence has come to light that reveals that the Soviet Union planned to invade Israel to help the Arabs. When Washington found out, they threatened to retaliate. In other words, we came awfully close to World War III.
Israel win over the Arab forces was so swift and so complete that it left the world to wonder how could a country the size of New Jersey win a war against the Arab armies that were backed by the Soviet Union and do it within such a short time. It seemed at the time impossible.
There was a lot more at stake during the 6-day war than just the security of Israel. The evidence has revealed that the Soviet Union had prepared plans to invade Israel as a part of its help to the Arab states. And such an invasion was prepared with the full understanding that it could lead to a major military clash between the Soviet Union and the United States, which itself could result in the nuclear war.
Whatever was happening on the political scene, the most fascinating thing about the 6-day war was that it was predicted in the Bible thousands of years ago. And it happened just as it was predicted.
There are many questions that beg for answers, and the more we delve into the history of the conflict, the more unexplained events come to the surface. Events that seem to be working in Israel's favor, like the strange circumstances surrounding Israel's first airstrike against Egypt.
The Israeli Air Force destroyed in a matter of hours 11 Egyptian air bases and most of the Egyptian Air Force. One should remember that with 4 Egyptian bases in Sinai, the Egyptian MiGs could be over the skies of Tel Aviv within a matter of 7 minutes.
Israel's surprise attack against Egypt was so successful, some military analysts say that the war was actually won in the first few hours. And yet, Egyptian air power was significantly greater than that of the Jewish state. So how did Israel pull it off?
Israel had planned a brilliant raid, which, if successful, would virtually assure them victory. They timed the attack so that all the 11 air bases would be hit at the same time. The raid was an unqualified success that made it impossible for the Egyptian Air Force to menace any city in Israel.
Most historians will tell you that Israel's success in the Six-Day War was due largely in part to the first airstrike. But the success of that attack hinged on an unexplained event, part of the miracle of the Six-Day War. The Israelis conducted the raid early in the morning, around 8 a.m. The Israelis anticipated that the Egyptians would be having tea at that hour, so they wouldn't be expecting an attack. But just in case they were wrong, Israeli jets flew in low over the Mediterranean Sea to avoid the enemy radar. At that point, the Egyptians should have detected the enemy fighters, but they didn't. Nothing happened. The Israelis were amazed, but continued on their mission to the air bases in Egypt. There they received another shock. There before them were all the enemy planes assembled for takeoff, neatly lined up in rows on the tarmac as if they were waiting to be destroyed. The Israelis wasted no time in taking advantage of the situation. They totally destroyed the Soviet-made fighter planes and bombers that should have been the biggest obstacle in winning the war.
So why didn't the Egyptians react? Even if the Israelis had avoided radar detection, their jets were visible to the naked eye. The flight path even took some of the planes directly over major landmarks like the Sphinx. So why wasn't the alarm sounded? General Mordecai Hod, commanding general of the Air Force, said, 16 years planning had gone into these initial 80 minutes. We lived with the plan, we slept on the plan, we ate the plan. Constantly we perfected it.
Well, the quality of an armed force is a function of planning and of execution. And as it turned out, both the planning and the execution were just right.
Was the Israeli attack plan so perfectly executed that the Egyptians were unable to mount a defense against the onslaught?
The reason the Egyptian Air Force wasn't prepared for an airstrike is they were ready to launch their own airstrike, and they were in having a victory breakfast. They'd all, this was to be a huge party celebrating the annihilation of Israel. And they got caught with their planes on the ground.
And even if they could not defend themselves, the Egyptians could have alerted their Arab allies so that a counterattack against Israel could have been launched. But they didn't. Many experts say that the outcome of the war would have been different if the Arabs had reacted in time. So why did the Egyptians remain silent?
During the Egyptian airstrike, only 12 fighting aircraft were left at Israel's Tel Aviv air bases. This left them extremely vulnerable. If Egypt's Arab allies had counterattacked, they would have been finished.
And yet, nothing happened. Why? Strange as it seems, the answer may lie in the roots of an ancient conflict.
Actually, the Jews and the Arabs are cousins. The founder of the Jewish people, Abraham, had two sons. One was Isaac, and the other was Ishmael. Isaac, who continued the Jewish line, Ishmael, who began the Arab line. And the fact also is that God promised Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars of the sky. He also promised that the land stretching from the Sinai desert north and east to the Euphrates River would belong to his descendants. But this was at the end of the days, in God's good time. It is absolutely forbidden for the Jews, the Israelites themselves, to force innocent people out of their homeland. Abraham questioned how it was possible for him and his wife Sarah, both beyond childbearing age, to have a son. But there is one guarantee and only one guarantee. It's called a covenant that God makes with the Jewish people. And that is that we will continue into history and never be destroyed. Therefore, God does the impossible biologically, and Abraham and Sarah have an heir.
God's plan as related in the biblical text is pretty straightforward. But problems arose when Sarah, Abraham's wife, doubted God's ability to give her a son. So she gave Hagar, her maidservant, to Abraham. and she bore him a son named Ishmael. He is the ancestor of the Arabs. Several years later, God did fulfill his promise, and Sarah herself gave birth to a son, whom she named Isaac. Now, according to the Bible, this was the child through whom God promised to fulfill his covenant, and who became the ancestor of the Jews. The Bible predicted that there would be a continuing conflict between the Arabs and the Jews. In Genesis 16:12, we find this ominous prophecy concerning Ishmael's descendants, the Arabs. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. I think there's no doubt this prophecy has been and is still being fulfilled.
Thus the conflict between Jew and Arab was born, and it continues even to this day. So who is the rightful owner of the land God promised to the descendants of Abraham? The Arabs insist that the birthright belongs to them. The Jews make the same claim. But the Arabs have taken the argument a step further. They believe that Israel not only has no right to the land, they have no right to exist at all. So deep is the divide between Arab and Jew that immediately before the Six-Day War began, the Arab allies left no doubt as to their goal. If the Egyptians' goal was to destroy Israel, there would seem to be no logical explanation for their inaction on the first day of the war. So why didn't they sound the alarm as soon as the Israeli air raid began?
Prior to the war, the Egyptians made some bold statements, and they say that they're going to destroy the state of Israel. The Arab world was cheering them on, and when they were defeated, it took them a very long time to digest the fact that their plans came so abruptly to an end.
The Egyptians were supposed to be leading the charge, but they had this incredibly humiliating defeat. There was no way they wanted that information to leak out, so they lied. They claimed victory.
How could the Egyptians have made such a serious blunder? Was pride the real reason that Egypt refrained from informing its Arab allies of Israel's destructive air raid? And even if this were true, why didn't the Egyptians sound the alarm and launch their own planes as soon as they saw the Israeli jets approaching? What was it that kept the Egyptian planes on the ground? Is the answer hidden in a top-secret conspiracy that remains under wraps even to this day? Could it be that the world was literally on the brink of a nuclear war? The Six-Day War began on June the 5th, 1967, with the Israelis pulling off a devastating and miraculously successful airstrike against Egyptian Air Force bases. Strangely enough, the Egyptians put up little or no fight in response to the attack. Stranger still, when you consider that the Egyptians themselves had set the stage for war just a few weeks earlier. They, more than anyone, should have been ready. On May 23, 1967, Egyptian President Nasser announced that he was closing the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping. Overnight, the key Israeli port of Elath became a virtual ghost town. The Israelis were cut off from their main access to East Africa, Asia, and the Persian Gulf oil they desperately needed to survive. This undeniable act of war was the spark that would ignite the powder keg.
The Arab world was definitely united in its hatred for Israel, but that didn't mean they completely trusted each other. Nevertheless, when Nasser shut down the Gulf of Aqaba, Arab leaders throughout the Middle East flew to Cairo to sign military pacts with Egypt. Even Jordan's King Hussein, who had a very thorny relationship with Nasser, put his army under the Egyptian leader's command.
The situation in 1967 resembles what's happening today, because then, just as now, trouble in the Middle East means trouble for all the major world powers.
Israel's Deputy Prime Minister, Abba Eban, immediately set out to rally the support of Western leaders, including President Johnson and French President Charles de Gaulle.
During the Six-Day War, the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union was pushed almost to the breaking point. For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, a message had been received over the Moscow-Washington hotline. The Soviets were threatening military action to prevent Israel's total victory in the conflict. Of course, the United States could not tolerate the Russian threat to invade Israel. If they did so, it would mean the United States would have to retaliate, which would mean nuclear warfare.
In June 1967, a young Soviet officer, Yuri Khripunkov, was serving on board of anti-submarine ship in Mediterranean. According to Khripunkov, he was ordered to raise and command a 30-man detachment for landing on the Israeli coast.
President Johnson immediately cleared the American Sixth Fleet for action in the Mediterranean, and Russia sent 10 warships in from the Black Sea to the same location. Of course, very few people knew what was really happening, but the potential for nuclear war was really there.
The storm clouds of war, gathering faster than anyone could have predicted. Two of the world's superpowers, with the ability to wage nuclear war, had become entangled in the mess. And yet, somehow, the impending catastrophe was avoided. The question is, how? How did Israel achieve the total victory they sought and yet avoid starting a nuclear war? After the conflict ended, the Arabs blamed their defeat on a conspiracy in which the United States was a key player. But why didn't the Soviets get involved as they had threatened? Is it possible that they were involved in a conspiracy of their own? And does this account for Egypt's lack of response to Israel's airstrike on the first day of the war?
One of the main reasons the Egyptians were gearing up for war was because they were under the mistaken impression that the Israelis were massing troops along the Syrian border.
As the conspiracy theory goes, false information was leaked to Egypt in order to make them believe that Syria was being threatened. By doing so, the Egyptians would be enticed into responding.
Some Arabs believe that the Americans aided in this conspiracy by deceiving the Egyptians into believing that the United States would restrain Israel and Israel would not strike until after a political solution had been reached to the crisis.
Well, Egypt fell into the trap and began sending troops to Syria. This then gave Israel an excuse for launching the preemptive strike against Nasser.
In late May of 1967, Egyptian President Nasser had been given what he believed to be reliable information about Israeli troop movements that informed him that Israel was massing troops on the Syrian border, an action that Egypt could not tolerate. But the surprising source of this information, which proved to be completely false, was none other than Egypt's ally, the Soviet Union.
Perhaps the least known aspect of all this conspiracy theory is the involvement of the Soviet Union. The historical records show that the Soviet Union deliberately gave the Egyptians false information about Israeli troops massing on the Syrian border. They calculated that this would provoke a response from Nasser, and apparently that's exactly what they wanted.
Some Egyptians believe the Soviets planted false reports of Israeli troop concentrations with them in order to show them how much they depended on the Soviets. From the Israeli point of view, there are some who believe that this was an attempt by the Soviets to start a war which would result in the destruction of Israel.
The reason that the Russians supplied false information to the Egyptians is because this was an opportunity to achieve their objective to dominate the Middle East. Israel was a mini superpower in that area. And so they felt they could control the Arab nations, so they supplied all of the weapons, the tanks, the planes, and trainers to accomplish this task to dominate that area.
To this day, senior former Soviet officials insist that it was not they who gave that information to the Egyptians, but the Egyptians who gave it to them. Having said that, though, one can see how the Soviet Union in the 1960s had an interest in fomenting unrest in the Middle East and opening a second front against the West in addition to Vietnam.
The plan worked perfectly. When Egypt received the false reports from the Soviets, Nasser immediately began massing troops on the Syrian border. This not only diverted his attention from air bases in the Egyptian interior, it also gave Israel an excuse to launch a preemptive first airstrike, which gave them a huge head start in winning the war. This, of course, is only a conspiracy theory, and even if it were true, it still doesn't explain why Egypt failed to respond to Israel's first devastating blow.
Egypt failed to respond because its air force had been destroyed on the ground in the first few hours of the fighting. The Egyptians had not struck first because they'd been under intense pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union not to do so.
There's speculation that the Americans then informed Israel that Egypt had been hemmed in. The two nations agreed that if Israel was to have any chance of surviving, they would have to strike first, while the Egyptians' hands were tied.
We may never know for sure if there were secret deals that contributed to the Arabs' defeat in the Six-Day War. But even if there were some truth to these theories, it would fail to explain the many other mysterious events that happened in the midst of the battle.
As the Israeli tanks moved into the Sinai Peninsula, the Egyptians seemed to be playing right into their hands. For example, there are accounts of the Egyptian tanks fleeing without being hit or firing around. Even stranger were the unexplained desertions of surface-to-air missile bases. The Egyptians abandoned military hardware, most of it Russian-made, worth well over $1 billion. Even complex radar guidance equipment had been left in operational order.
It's not unusual for troops to retreat in the face of an advancing army. What is unusual is for thousands of troops to leave behind massive amounts of military material, billions of dollars worth, without any attempt to disable that material. This happened several times during the course of the Six-Day War.
What made the enemy withdraw so quickly? Is it possible that they had experienced something so frightening that they had to retreat, even before they could make sure their own weapons did not fall into enemy hands? And do these events suggest that Israel had some kind of secret weapon that helped them win the war?
After their defeat in the Six-Day War, the Arab leaders were criticized by their friends and allies. How come their armies were defeated so easily, so quickly by the Israeli defense or combat forces? Political and military leaders of the Arab states claimed after the war that the Israelis used secret weapons.
Egyptian President Nasser continued to blame Egypt's defeat on American intervention in the conflict. So, is it possible that the United States furnished Israel with a secret weapon and kept it quiet for all these years?
Well, it's certainly not unusual for a weapon of mass destruction to turn the tide of war. And we all know that the atomic bomb is a perfect example. During World War II, the Japanese had vowed to fight unto the death. But when the United States unleashed their nuclear power on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese had no choice but to surrender.
I'm convinced that there was divine intervention in the Six-Day War. When you compare the two armies and see the size of the number of soldiers as well as the buildup of machinery, you know that it couldn't have possibly happened without some outside help.
Israel was one nation against a sea of Arab states. It certainly looked as if we would lose, hands down, and cease being a nation amongst nations. When we won, and especially when we liberated the holy city of Jerusalem, there was no question in our minds that this was a war, a victory designed by God.
Were the United States and Israel, in fact, working together behind the scenes? Was it American influence? Or did the Israeli alliance with their God have something to do with it? Officially, Israel and her enemies alike are quick to downplay any supernatural intervention on behalf of Israel. Yet the ancient prophecies are there for all to read. The sons of Ishmael have certainly become a great nation. And since the reestablishment of Israel in 1947, they have certainly set their hand against their ancient cousins. Given what's happening today in the Middle East, it might not be a bad idea to pay very close attention to what the prophets have had to say.